Okay, so get ready, because we are diving back into the Natalia Grace case. And, uh, this is getting more complex every day, it seems like, expert speaker.
Yeah, remember when we talked about how it seemed like she finally found a good place with the man's family?
Right.
Well, things have taken a turn.
Definitely a twist.
Yeah, a sharp turn. And it's left us with a lot of questions.
Yeah, it's a twist that no one saw coming.
Yeah.
The Mances, who, at first were really portrayed as like Natalia's saviors,
Right.
are now calling her the enemy and distancing themselves completely.
Yeah.
So that's a dramatic shift.
Yeah.
And it really makes us wonder what might have happened
It's a real head scratcher.
behind closed doors.
Yeah.
Just to refresh everyone's memory, we're talking about Natalia Grace, the young woman with dwarfism who was at the center of that whole thing with her former adoptive parents, the Barnetts,
Right.
so the age dispute and all that.
Yeah.
The Mances came in and offered her a home and what seemed like a fresh start. They even used part of Natalia's settlement money for a new house.
Mm-hmm.
And it really did seem like a happy ending.
Exactly, and that's what makes this change so jarring. The Manses were very publicly supportive of Natalia advocating for her and,
Right.
trying to paint this picture of a loving, stable home.
Mm-hmm.
And then just 6 months later, they're contacting documentary producers wanting nothing to do with her.
Yeah.
It's a complete 180, and it makes you wonder what happened.
Yeah, and that's where things take an even more interesting turn. Natalia actually ends up fleeing the Mance's home in Tennessee with the help of her online boyfriend, Neil, and ends up in New York seeking refuge with the DePaul family.
Oh, wow.
Remember them?
Yeah.
They considered adopting Natalia before the Barnetts.
Right, right. Yeah, it's almost like history is repeating itself with Natalia seeking stability and support outside of her family.
Right.
So you have to wonder what prompted this escape. What happened in the Mance's household to make Natalia feel unsafe or unwelcome?
That's the million-dollar question. And unfortunately, we just don't have all the answers yet. But we do know that the financial aspect of this situation raises some concerns. Even after Natalia left their home, the Mances retained control over her disability payments and that $300,000 settlement she got from the Dr. Phil show.
Yeah, that financial control is definitely troubling. And on top of that, a big tax bill shows up addressed to Natalia for money she never even had access to.
Right.
The Mances refused to pay it.
Wow.
So it really makes you question, were their intentions really altruistic or was there some exploitation involved?
It's a troubling thought.
Yeah.
And this actually isn't the first time we've seen these kinds of allegations of financial manipulation in Natalia's story.
Right.
Remember the accusations against the Barnetts who supposedly changed Natalia's age for financial gain?
Mm-hmm.
Now we're seeing similar concerns about
Absolutely. The parallels are undeniable.
Yeah. And then we have Robert Madewell, who enters the picture, adding another layer of complexity to this already crazy case. Madewell is the father of a child who was cared for by the Mances.
Okay.
And he's come forward with some disturbing allegations.
Oh, wow.
He says that the Mances' behavior was abusive and controlling, and he goes so far as to use the term cult to characterize their household.
Wow.
His claims definitely need further investigation, but it's not a pretty picture he's painting.
No, not at all. And, when you combine his allegations with the financial control issues and the Mance's complete change of attitude toward Natalia,
Right.
it creates a really unsettling narrative, and it makes you wonder if they were really providing a safe and loving home for Natalia or if something else was going on.
Yeah, and this leads to the question that's been around this case for a while. The idea of brainwashing and cult-like behavior. When you think about the Mances' strict religious practices, their homeschooling methods, and the alleged isolation of their children, it's hard not to compare it to other situations we've seen where manipulation and control were major factors.
Yeah, those elements are worth examining more closely. The isolation, the strict following of a specific set of beliefs, the control of finances, and then these allegations of abuse. These are all signs of a potentially manipulative and harmful environment.
Right. And it's not just Madewell who's worried about this. Michael Barnett's lawyer, Karen Skinnard, has also labeled the Mances a cult.
Yeah.
And even the DePauls, who are now caring for Natalia,
Right.
believe she was brainwashed first by the Barnetts and now maybe by the Mances.
So we have multiple people who have interacted with Natalia and the family she's lived with who are expressing these concerns about brainwashing and cult-like behavior.
Yeah.
We can't ignore these red flags.
Right.
We have to consider the possibility that Natalia's sense of reality might be distorted because of what she's experienced.
It's a truly perplexing situation. We have Natalia, who initially defended the Mances, echoing their story,
Right.
even after leaving their home. But there are whispers and accusations suggesting a much darker reality.
Yeah.
Could this be a sign of such deep manipulation that Natalia doesn't even fully understand it herself?
It's a chilling thought, but it's possible,
Yeah.
especially when we consider the potential influence of that type of controlling environment.
Right.
When someone is constantly exposed to a very specific ideology and their access to information and support is limited,
Right.
it can have a huge impact on how they see the world.
So are we talking about brainwashing here? I know it's a term that's used a lot in the media, but could this be an actual real-life example of it happening?
The term brainwashing itself can be a little too simple,
Right.
but the idea of thought reform is definitely real, and it's been studied a lot, especially with cults and abusive relationships.
Right.
Thought reform is a systematic process of breaking down a person's existing beliefs and replacing them with a new set of often rigid doctrines.
That sounds really disturbing. How does that even happen? How can someone manipulate another person's thoughts and beliefs like that?
It's a gradual process and often subtle.
Right.
It combines a bunch of different psychological techniques.
Okay.
Isolating the person from outside influences is key. They're cut off from family, friends, and any information that might challenge the group's ideology.
Right.
And then there's constant reinforcement of the group's beliefs through things like repetitive teachings, rituals, and even public confessions.
So it's like creating this closed loop where the only information and validation they get comes from inside the group.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And over time, this can change how the person thinks. They start to doubt their own perceptions, they question their past experiences, and eventually they accept the group's beliefs as their own.
And how does trauma fit into all this?
Yeah.
Natalia's life has been full of upheaval and uncertainty.
Yeah.
From the abandonment by the Barnetts to the media frenzy about her age, and now this whole thing with the Manses.
Right.
Could those experiences have made her more susceptible to this type of manipulation?
Trauma definitely plays a big role. When someone goes through repeated trauma, especially when they're young, it can destroy their sense of security and make them really want stability and belonging.
Right.
This can make them more likely to be drawn to a group or a person who promises safety and unconditional acceptance.
So in a way, Natalia's vulnerability might have made her a prime target for exploitation.
That's a good point. It's important to remember that people who have been through trauma often need connection and validation,
Yeah.
which can make them more trusting and less likely to question authority figures or people who present themselves as caregivers.
And this brings us to another unsettling part of Natalia's story. The financial control the Manses had. Even after she left their home, they still controlled her disability payments and the settlement money.
Yeah.
Is there anything legally she can do about that?
It's a serious concern, and it definitely raises legal questions.
No.
Depending on the specifics and the laws where this happened, it's possible that what the Manses did could be considered financial exploitation or abuse. Natalia would need a lawyer to look into whether any laws were broken and to help her get control of her money back.
It seems like she's been trapped in this web of manipulation, both emotionally and financially. It makes you wonder, how can someone in Natalia's position escape this kind of control and regain their agency?
Breaking free from this type of control is really difficult, especially when thought reform and trauma are involved. It often requires a multifaceted approach that involves building trust, creating a safe space for open communication, and giving them access to resources and support systems that can help them deconstruct what they've been conditioned to believe.
So what would that support system look like?
Ideally, it would involve access to therapy that's specifically designed for trauma survivors.
Okay.
And ideally with a therapist who understands cult dynamics and the effects of manipulation. This kind of therapist can help Natalia process what she's been through, develop ways to cope, and slowly regain her sense of self.
And what about legal help? Would that be important for her too?
Absolutely. Having a good lawyer is essential to protect Natalia's rights and make sure she's financially secure. The lawyer can investigate potential legal violations, help her regain control of her money, and represent her in any legal proceedings that might come up.
It sounds like a long and difficult road, but it sounds like with the right support, there's hope for Natalia to heal and rebuild her life.
There's always hope. And we need to remember that Natalia, despite everything she's been through, is remarkably resilient. She escaped not one, but two potentially harmful situations. That takes a lot of courage and strength.
Yeah.
With the right support and guidance, she can overcome these challenges and create a better future for herself.
That's an important point to remember. Amidst all the complexities and uncertainties, Natalia's resilience is clear.
It is. And it reminds us that even when faced with manipulation and trauma, the human spirit can endure and eventually triumph.
Well said. Now let's talk about another part of this case that's been generating a lot of discussion. the allegations of cult-like behavior within the Mandas household.
Okay.
We talked about some of the red flags earlier.
Right.
Well, let's dig a little deeper into what actually makes a group or organization a cult and how these dynamics might have played out in Natalia's situation.
The term cult itself can be controversial and doesn't always have a clear definition.
Right.
However, there are certain characteristics and behaviors that are commonly associated with cult-like groups.
Okay.
These include a charismatic leader who has a lot of influence over members,
Yeah.
a system of beliefs that is often rigid and doesn't tolerate disagreement, and techniques of manipulation and control that are used to keep members in line.
So it's not just about having unusual beliefs or practices.
Right.
It's more about the power dynamics within the group and how those dynamics are used to exploit and control people.
Exactly, and that's where the BITE model, which was developed by cult expert Stephen Hassan, is helpful for understanding how cults work. BITE stands for behavior control, information control, thought control, and emotional control. These 4 categories cover a wide range of tactics used by cult leaders to manipulate their followers.
Can you give some examples of how these control tactics might show up in a group or family setting?
Sure, behavior control can involve things like regulating members' daily routines, dictating how they dress, and restricting their contact with the outside world. Information control is about limiting access to information that might challenge the group's beliefs, often by censoring books, websites, or even conversations with people outside the group.
That sounds incredibly restrictive.
Yeah.
What about thought control and emotional control? How do those work?
Thought control often uses loaded language and thought-stopping techniques to discourage critical thinking.
Okay.
Members are taught to accept the group's doctrines as absolute truth and to suppress any doubts or questions they might have.
Mm-hmm.
Emotional control involves manipulating members' emotions through guilt, shame, fear, and even love bombing.
Love bombing.
Yeah. It's a tactic where they shower new recruits with a lot of attention and affection to make them feel like they belong and depend on the group.
Wow. It's scary to think that these tactics, which are often associated with extreme religious groups, can also happen in more subtle ways within families and close communities.
You're right. Cult dynamics can exist anywhere. There's an imbalance of power and a systematic attempt to control and manipulate others. And families aren't immune to these dynamics.
So how can we apply this understanding of cult dynamics to Natalia's situation with the Manses? Are there specific things they did that suggest she might have been subjected to this kind of control?
Based on what we know, there are definitely some red flags that need to be looked into more closely. The allegations of isolation from the outside world, the strict religious practices, and the financial control by the Manses all fit with the BITE model
Right.
and raise concerns about potential cult-like behavior.
And we can't forget about how quickly their attitude toward Natalia changed. One minute they're saying she's their beloved daughter, and the next minute they're calling her the enemy and want nothing to do with her.
That's a really important point. That sudden demonization of a former member is a classic tactic used by cults to reinforce their beliefs and prevent disagreement.
Right.
By making Natalia out to be a threat or a manipulator, the Manses keep control of the narrative and potentially stop other members from questioning their authority.
So if Natalia was actually subjected to this manipulation, how might it be affecting her behavior and her ability to talk about her experiences?
That's a question that requires a lot of thought and empathy. If Natalia has been indoctrinated into a specific belief system or subjected to emotional and psychological abuse, it's possible that how she sees reality might be distorted.
Right.
She might be struggling to reconcile her own experiences with what she's been taught to believe,
Right.
which could lead to inconsistencies in what she says or a reluctance to speak out against the Manses.
So it's not as simple as her either lying or telling the truth.
Right.
There could be a mix of emotions, fear, and maybe even a lingering sense of obligation or dependence
Exactly.
that's stopping her from fully opening up about what she's been through.
It's important to remember that even if what Natalia says seems confusing or contradictory, it doesn't mean her experiences aren't real, or that the harm she might have endured is any less significant.
This case is so complicated, and with each new piece of information we get,
Right.
even more questions come up.
Yeah.
What I find really fascinating is Natalia's escape to New York with Neil's help.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to go against the image the Manses presented of her
Right.
as a child who needed constant care and supervision.
That's a great point. The fact that she escaped shows a level of resourcefulness and independence that completely contradicts what the Manses were saying about her.
Right.
It suggests she might be more capable and independent than they made her out to be.
It makes you wonder, what else are we missing? What aspects of her personality and abilities have been hidden or downplayed to fit a particular narrative?
That's a really good question. And it highlights how important it is to approach this case with an open mind and a willingness to challenge our own preconceived notions.
It's tempting to try to categorize Natalia as either a victim or a manipulator,
Right.
but the truth is probably much more complex than that.
Exactly. And that's what makes this case so compelling. It forces us to think about how complicated human behavior is, the power dynamics within families, and the insidious nature of manipulation and control.
We've really been digging into some disturbing stuff. The allegations of abuse, the possibility of Natalia being brainwashed, and the financial exploitation she may have faced.
Yeah, that's heavy stuff.
But there is a glimmer of hope in all this.
Right.
Natalia's escape to New York and the support she's getting from the DePauls, it seems like she's starting to take back control of her life, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. Natalia's decision to leave the Mances' home, get help from Neil and the DePauls, and then move to New York shows a level of assertiveness and a drive to protect herself.
Right.
That's pretty remarkable, especially given the environment she was supposedly in.
It makes you wonder, what was she thinking when she escaped? What gave her the strength to get out of a situation that, from what we've heard, was potentially controlling and manipulative?
That's a tough question to answer for sure. But it is clear that Natalia found strength and support outside the man's household. Her online relationship with Neil might have given her a connection to the outside world, like a lifeline.
Right.
And the DePauls, having almost adopted her before, probably felt familiar and trustworthy.
That's interesting that you mentioned trust, because one of the most confusing parts of this whole case is Natalia's seemingly conflicting statements.
Right.
On one hand, we hear she confided in friends, telling them she was scared of the Mances and didn't like living there.
Yeah.
But then on the other hand, she seems hesitant to publicly say anything bad about them. How do we make sense of that?
It is a bit of a puzzle. It's
Yeah.
possible that what Natalia is experiencing is called cognitive dissonance.
Okay.
It's this psychological thing that happens when someone has beliefs that clash or they do things that go against their values. In Natalia's case, she might be struggling with a few things at the same time.
Right.
The good image of the Mances that everyone saw at first, the loyalty she might feel toward them as her adoptive parents,
Right.
and then the alleged mistreatment she went through behind closed doors.
So it's not just about her lying or telling the truth. It could be this complicated mix of emotions, fear, and maybe even some feeling of obligation or dependence on them
Exactly.
that's making it hard for her to really talk about what happened.
Right. And it just shows how important it is to be empathetic and understand the psychological effects of trauma and manipulation.
Right.
When someone's been in a cult-like situation, they might struggle with guilt, shame, or even fear of what will happen if they speak out against their abusers.
That's a scary thought.
Yeah.
It makes you realize how deep those scars of manipulation can go and how hard it can be to break free from those mental and emotional bonds.
Absolutely. And it highlights why people who have been through this type of abuse need special support and therapy. It's not as simple as telling someone to just get over it or to just tell the truth. It takes a delicate and understanding approach that acknowledges how complicated their situation is and gives them the power to find their voice again at their own pace.
So how can we best help someone like Natalia? What resources and support systems are the most important for her healing and recovery?
The most important thing is that she needs a safe and supportive environment where she feels heard and believed. It sounds like the DePauls are providing that, which is a good start.
Right.
But on top of that, she really needs access to therapy that's designed for people who have experienced trauma.
Okay.
A therapist who specializes in cult dynamics and the effects of manipulation can help Natalia process everything she's gone through, teach her coping skills,
Right.
and help her slowly rebuild her self-trust and independence.
And what about the legal side of things? We talked about the possible financial exploitation and the allegations of abuse. What legal options does Natalia have, and what steps can be taken to protect her rights and keep her safe?
Yeah.
It depends on the specifics of the case and the laws in the area where it happened.
Right.
But she would need a good lawyer who can investigate the allegations, gather evidence, and maybe even take legal action against the Mances if necessary.
Right.
This could involve things like filing for a restraining order, trying to get her money back,
Right.
or even working with law enforcement if there's proof of a crime.
It sounds like a long and tough process, but it's really inspiring to see people like the DePauls step up to give Natalia care and support right now.
Yeah, their willingness to open their home and their hearts to Natalia is amazing. It really shows their compassion and how much they care about her well-being. But we also need to acknowledge that supporting someone who's been through trauma and manipulation can be difficult.
Definitely. What advice would you give to people or families who are supporting someone in a similar situation? What are some things to keep in mind, and what resources can they turn to for guidance?
That's a great question. Supporting someone in this situation takes patience, understanding, and a willingness to learn about how trauma and manipulation work. It's super important to avoid judging, blaming, or pressuring them. Instead, the focus should be on creating a safe and supportive space where they feel comfortable sharing their experiences at their own pace.
So it's about listening, believing them, and giving them resources without forcing our own expectations or timelines on their healing.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that we can't force someone to talk about what happened to them or to take legal action if they're not ready. Our job is to support them, give them information, and connect them with professionals who can guide them through this really tough experience.
As we wrap up this part of our deep dive, what's the main message you want listeners to take away from Natalia's story? What have we learned, and how can we use this knowledge in our own lives and relationships?
Natalia's story is a powerful reminder that things aren't always as they appear,
Right.
and that abuse and manipulation can happen in the most unexpected places, even within families that seem loving and stable to the outside world.
Right.
It teaches us how important critical thinking is to question what we assume to be true and to recognize the warning signs of potential manipulation.
It's a reminder that we all have a responsibility to be aware of these things, to learn about the tactics abusers use, and to speak up for those who might be suffering in silence. If you see something, say something.
Yeah, your voice can make all the difference. And if Natalia's story has touched you or made you worry about someone you know, please don't hesitate to reach out for help. There are resources available, and staying silent only allows the abuse to continue.
This case is definitely not over, and we'll keep following it as things develop. We'll let you know about any updates and provide more insights as we get them. Till then, stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, stay compassionate.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Natalia Grace case. It's a complicated and multifaceted story that makes us confront uncomfortable truths and stand up for those who are most vulnerable.
Remember, even in the darkest situations, there's always hope for healing and recovery. And sometimes the most powerful way to support someone is to simply believe their story and give them a safe space to share their truth. So we've talked about these really disturbing allegations of abuse and the possibility of Natalia being in a cult-like situation and the financial exploitation.
Right.
But in all of this, there's this glimmer of hope, Natalia escaping to New York and the support from the DePauls. It seems like she's taking back control of her life, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, it really seems like Natalia deciding to leave the Manses, getting help from Neil and the DePauls, and then going to New York shows real assertiveness.
Right.
And this drive to protect herself, which is pretty amazing considering the environment she was supposedly living in.
Makes you think, what was going through her head during that escape? What gave her the strength to leave a situation that, by many accounts, was really controlling and manipulative?
Yeah, that's a question we can only guess at. But one thing's for sure. Natalia found strength and support outside the Manses home. Her online relationship with Neil might have given her that connection to the outside world, and the DePauls, having almost adopted her before, probably represented some sense of familiarity and trust.
It's interesting you mentioned trust, because one of the most puzzling things in this whole case is Natalia's statements, which seem to contradict each other.
Yeah.
On one hand, we hear that she told friends she was afraid of the Manses and didn't want to live there.
Right.
But then she doesn't really want to publicly say anything negative about them. How do we reconcile those two things?
It's a fascinating puzzle, for sure. It's possible Natalia's experiencing something called cognitive dissonance.
Yeah.
It's this psychological thing that happens when someone has two beliefs that clash, or they do things that go against their values. In Natalia's case, she might be struggling with a few different things.
Yep.
That positive picture of the Manses that everyone saw at first, the loyalty she might feel towards them because they were her adoptive parents.
Right.
And then the mistreatment that she reportedly experienced behind closed doors.
So it's not as easy as saying she's either lying or telling the truth. There could be all these complicated emotions, fear, and maybe even some sense of obligation or dependence.
Exactly.
That's making it hard for her to really open up about what happened.
It's a good point.
Yeah.
And it highlights the need to approach this case with empathy and an understanding of the psychological effects of trauma and manipulation.
Right.
You know, if Natalia was in a cult-like situation, she might be dealing with guilt shame or even fear of what will happen if she speaks out against the Manses.
It's a scary thought. It makes you realize how deep those scars from manipulation can go and how difficult it can be to break free from those mental and emotional ties.
Absolutely. And it underscores the need for specialized support and therapeutic intervention for people who've been through this type of abuse.
Hmm.
You can't just tell someone to snap out of it
Right.
or to just tell the truth. It requires a sensitive and compassionate approach that acknowledges how complex their situation is and empowers them to find their voice again in their own time.
So what's the best way to help someone like Natalia? What resources or support systems are most critical for her healing and recovery?
Well, first and foremost, she needs a safe and supportive environment where she feels heard and believed. It sounds like the DePauls are providing that, which is great.
Right.
But she also really needs access to therapy, specifically trauma-informed therapy. A therapist who understands cult dynamics and the effects of manipulation can help Natalia process her experiences, develop coping mechanisms,
Right.
and start to rebuild her sense of self-trust and independence.
What about the legal aspects? We talked about the possible financial exploitation and the abuse allegations. What can Natalia do legally, and what steps can be taken to protect her rights and make sure she's safe?
The legal options will depend on the specifics of the case and what the laws are where it happened.
Right.
But she needs a good lawyer who can investigate the allegations, gather evidence,
Right.
and maybe even take legal action against the Manses if it's appropriate. That might mean getting a restraining order, trying to get her money back, or even working with law enforcement if there's evidence of a crime.
It sounds like a long road, but it's really inspiring to see people like the DePauls step up and give Natalia care and support.
Yeah, their willingness to open up their home and their hearts to Natalia is amazing. It really shows how compassionate they are and how much they care about her well-being. But we also need to acknowledge that supporting someone who has experienced this kind of trauma and manipulation can be tough.
For sure. What advice would you give to people or families who are trying to support someone in a similar situation? What should they keep in mind, and what resources are out there to help them?
That's a great question. Supporting someone in this situation takes patience, understanding, and a willingness to learn about how trauma and manipulation work.
Right.
It's crucial to avoid judging, blaming, or pressuring them. Instead, the focus should be on creating a safe and supportive space where they feel comfortable sharing their experiences at their own pace.
So basically listening, believing them, and giving them resources without forcing our own expectations or timelines on their healing process.
Exactly. And we also need to remember that we can't make someone disclose their experiences or take legal action if they're not ready. Our role is to be there for them, give them information, and connect them with professionals who can help them through this really difficult time.
As we wrap up this deep dive,
Yeah.
what's the key takeaway you want our listeners to get from Natalia's story? What have we learned, and how can we apply these insights to our own lives and how we interact with others?
Natalia's story is a powerful reminder that things aren't always as they appear. Abuse and manipulation can happen anywhere,
Yeah.
even in families that seem loving and stable from the outside. It shows us how important critical thinking is, questioning our assumptions and recognizing the red flags of manipulation.
It reminds us that we all have a responsibility to be aware of these dynamics, to learn about the tactics that abusers use, and to speak up for those who might be suffering in silence. If you see something, say something.
Exactly. Your voice could make all the difference. And if Natalia's story has touched you, or if you're worried about someone you know, please don't hesitate to reach out for help. There are resources out there, and silence only allows the abuse to continue.
This case is definitely not over, and we'll be keeping an eye on it as it develops. We'll keep you updated on anything new and share more insights as we get them. Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, stay compassionate.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Natalia Grace case. It's a complex and layered story that makes us confront some uncomfortable truths and reminds us to speak up for those who are most vulnerable.
Remember, even in the darkest situations, there's always hope for healing and recovery. And sometimes the most powerful way to support someone is to simply believe their story and give them a safe space to share their truth.